Naples. A kitchen, right now, somewhere in this city. A pot of red sauce simmering on the stove. Garlic, basil, tomato. Ask anyone on earth to name one food that defines Italy, and this is probably it. Here's the problem. The tomato has never, in its entire existence, grown wild in Italy. Not once, not ever. It didn't arrive in Europe until the 1500s, and when it did, nobody in Italy wanted to eat it. For over 200 years, this fruit sat on European tables as decoration. Admired, painted, studied, never eaten. Because botanists of the era were convinced this bright red fruit was closely related to some of the deadliest plants known to man. Belladonna, deadly nightshade. There are documented historical accounts of European aristocrats falling gravely ill and dying after eating off tin alloy plates that reacted with the tomato's natural acidity. They blamed the fruit, not the plate. For 2 centuries, an entire continent looked at what would become the single most essential ingredient in Italian cuisine and saw a killer. So what changed? How did a fruit European nobility feared enough to paint but never touch end up in nearly every Italian dish eaten on the planet today? The answer isn't a simple story of a food catching on. It's a story of poverty, war, empire, and one specific port city that changed the fate of a fruit forever. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how the tomato went from feared poison to Italy's edible identity. To understand this fruit, you have to leave Italy completely. Go back further than Rome, further than the Renaissance, all the way to the western slopes of South America. The wild ancestor of the tomato is believed to have originated in the region that is now Peru and Ecuador. Small, yellow, barely resembling what sits in your kitchen today. But it wasn't domesticated there. That happened further north, in Mesoamerica. The Aztecs cultivated it, bred it, cooked with it. They even gave it the name history would eventually inherit. Tomatl. The root of the word you use today. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in Mexico in the early 1500s, they encountered a fruit unlike anything back home. And they did what conquistadors did with almost everything they found. They took it. By the mid-1500s, tomato seeds had crossed the Atlantic, planted first in Spain, then, quickly, into Italy. The first confirmed written record of the tomato in Italy comes from 1544. A botanist and physician named Pietro Andrea Mattioli. He described a strange new fruit related to the eggplant that could be sliced and fried in oil. He gave it a name that stuck: Pomodoro, golden apple, which tells us something important. The very first tomatoes recorded in Italy were likely yellow. But Mattioli was also a trained botanist, and when he classified this new fruit scientifically, he placed it in the same plant family as something far more dangerous. The nightshade family, Solanaceae. The same family as belladonna, deadly nightshade itself. That single classification would haunt the tomato for 200 years. Wealthy Italian and European households grew it, in gardens, in courtyards, purely as an ornamental curiosity, something to admire from a safe distance. Meanwhile, in the poorer south of Italy, in a city choking under Spanish colonial rule and grinding poverty, people were running out of patience for fear. They were running out of food. And in 1692, a a steward working for the Spanish viceroy in that city, did something almost nobody had dared put into writing before. He wrote down a recipe, a sauce made from tomatoes. The first known tomato sauce recipe in European history, and it was about to come from the one city in Italy hungry enough, desperate enough, and stubborn enough to finally put this poison on a plate. The man who wrote it down was named Antonio Latini. A steward, a scalco, working in the kitchens of Spanish nobility in Naples. In 1692, he published a cookbook, Lo Scalco alla Moderna. Inside it, a recipe called Salsa di Pomodoro alla Spagnola. Spanish-style tomato sauce. Chopped tomato, onion, chili pepper, thyme, vinegar. The first known tomato sauce recipe ever written down in Europe. But here's the detail that surprises almost everyone. It wasn't served with pasta. Latini's sauce was a fresh, uncooked condiment, meant for meat, for boiled dishes, not for the dried macaroni Naples was already famous for. That pairing, tomato and pasta, the combination that would define Italian food forever, didn't happen yet. It took another century and a half. Through the 1700s, Naples was exploding in population. Overcrowded, desperately poor. The city's poorest residents, known as the Lazzaroni, survived largely on dried macaroni, eaten by hand, straight off street carts. Plain pasta needed flavor, needed to be cheap, needed to fill a starving stomach. And the tomato, by now, was growing everywhere in the region. Abundant, nearly free. The written proof of that fusion finally arrives in 1837. A Neapolitan nobleman and cook named Ippolito Cavalcanti published Cuisine teorico-pratica. Inside it, a recipe explicitly combining macaroni with tomato sauce. In print, documented, undeniable. Nearly 300 years after the tomato first arrived on Italian soil, it had finally, officially, met pasta. And once that marriage happened, it spread fast. But nothing cemented the tomato's place in Italian identity quite like what allegedly happened in 1889. Now, I have to be honest with you about this next part. Historians consider it a legend. Popular, widely repeated, not fully verified. The story goes that a Neapolitan pizza maker, Raffaele Esposito, prepared a pizza for Queen Margherita of Savoy. Topped with red tomato, white mozzarella, and green basil. The exact 3 colors of the newly unified Italian flag. Italy had only become a unified nation less than 3 decades earlier, in 1861. A country still stitching together dozens of regional identities into one. True or not, the timing tells you everything. The tomato wasn't just being eaten anymore. It was being used to define what Italian even meant. A fruit that had spent 200 years locked out of Italian kitchens as a suspected poison had become the literal color of the national flag on a plate. But the tomato's biggest transformation was still ahead. Because in the century that followed, it wouldn't just conquer Italian kitchens. It would leave Italy behind entirely and conquer the world. Canned, exported, and rebuilt into a billion-dollar global industry. By the late 1800s, Italy had a new problem. Too many tomatoes. The volcanic soil around Mount Vesuvius near Naples turned out to be almost perfectly suited to growing them. Rich, mineral-dense, blessed by centuries of eruptions. One particular variety, grown in the plain of the Sarno River, became legendary for its sweetness and low acidity. The San Marzano. But fresh tomatoes only lasted so long. Italy needed a way to preserve the harvest and sell it far beyond Naples. The answer arrived from France. Nicolas Appér's canning method, developed in the early 1800s to feed Napoleon's armies. Italian producers adapted it specifically for tomatoes. By the 1870s and 1880s, canning factories were opening across the region around Naples and Parma. Suddenly, a fruit that couldn't survive a Roman winter could survive an ocean crossing. Sealed in tin, shipped anywhere on Earth. And at the exact same moment this technology matured, millions of Italians were leaving the country. Between the 1880s and the 1920s, waves of Italian emigrants crossed the Atlantic, searching for work. Many settled in the United States, New York, New Jersey, Chicago. They carried recipes with them, and they carried demand for canned San Marzano tomatoes, shipped directly from home. Italian-American communities became the engine that introduced tomato-based Italian cooking to an entire continent. Red sauce, pizza, spaghetti and meatballs, itself notably an American invention, not a traditional Italian dish. The tomato didn't just travel with Italians. It became the ambassador for an entire cuisine that the rest of the world would come to call simply Italian food. Today, Italy remains one of the largest tomato producers in Europe. San Marzano tomatoes grown in the volcanic soil near Naples now carry a protected designation of origin from the European Union, a legal safeguard, a guarantee of authenticity. Protecting a fruit that 400 years ago wasn't considered safe enough to touch. Think about the distance this fruit has traveled. Feared as poison by European nobility, it's grown only as decoration for 2 centuries. Adopted by Naples out of sheer poverty and hunger. Legally protected today as a symbol of Italian national pride. The same plant family that once condemned it to 200 years of suspicion and fear is the exact same plant that now defines, for most of the planet, what Italian food even tastes like. So think back to where this story started. A fruit, painted but never eaten. Admired from across a room, feared on the tongue. For 200 years, the tomato sat at the edge of European life, close enough to see, too dangerous to taste. And then hunger did what curiosity never could. It wasn't a king who made the tomato Italian. It wasn't a scientist proving the fear wrong in a laboratory. It was the poorest people in Naples, eating what they could afford, on the streets, with their hands. That's the part of this story worth sitting with. The thing the world now considers essential, ancient, unmistakably Italian, was once a stranger, an outsider, a suspect. It took centuries, empty stomachs, and one unlikely partnership with dried pasta to turn a feared import into a national identity. Which raises a quieter question, worth carrying with you after this video ends. How many of the things we call traditional, ancient, authentic, were once just as new, just as feared, just as foreign. So the next time you twirl a fork through a plate of red sauce, remember what it took to get there. Not tradition, not heritage, just hunger and the courage to finally take a bite.